2 years, so let's hope we get the white pieces, and we do. Samutpong from Thailand. Now let's go b3. So there's a long history behind the move b3. You guys have seen me play it in my real Blitz games, and I've even played it over the board. This is called the Nimzo-Larsen. It's usually called the Nimzo-Larsen. Yeah, it does sound like Vivaldi. And this is the ultimate hyper-modern opening. It's the OG hyper-modern opening because you're saying, I literally don't give a shit about the center. I don't want to occupy the center with pawns. I want to get my bishop fianchettoed so that I attack the center from a distance. Oh my god. Oh. H5. Pre-moved. Okay. Now that's quite the idea. That might be a novelty, actually. He's probably going to pre-move h4. I should play bishop takes g7. Now, we're going to play the classic b3 setup regardless of what he decides to do. And the zen behind the b3 setup is to clamp down on the center in a way that doesn't obstruct the bishop. What kinds of moves control some of the center without obstructing the bishop? Well, basically anything other than d4. And at some point, playing d4 is fine. So e4 is okay, but it's not a great move to combine with b3. And it's a bit hard for me to explain why that is, but I'll show you guys after the game. The combination of the moves e4 and b3 can be quite a bit awkward. So generally, white plays e3 in these types of structures. White plays e3. And e3 just works better with b3. It's a more modest move, but it's more solid. So c4 is also often played. Let's begin with the move e3 and a5. Okay, so a5 is a bit of a more serious move than h5 because he wants to play a4. I mean, a5 is a legitimate move in such positions. And we need to nip this in the bud. How do we nip this in the bud? There's many good ways to nip this in the bud. The obvious move is simply to play a4. There's nothing wrong with that. But a4 slightly weakens the b4 square. What other methods do you guys know of taking the sting out of a4? What other methods exist? So there's knight c3, but knight c3 blocks the bishop. This knight on b1 usually doesn't go out to c3 until later. But the other option, as Lono informs us, he's the resident specialist, is to play a3. a3 prepares to meet a4 with b4. I'm literally sure everybody has seen this idea before. Okay, now let's develop our knight. He's spent exactly 1 second. c6, now he plays more or less normal moves. And like I said, at some point, you're going to probably play d4. And d4 leads to a situation which some of you may not fully understand intuitively, which is okay, because you might look at the move d4 and say, well, then why did we fianchetto the bishop? Well, you should think of the bishop as an extension, or the pawn as an extension of the bishop. The placement of the pawn on d4 is temporary. Another way to think about it is that the bishop's going to have a lot of bishop is going to have a lot of potential energy. At some point later in the game, that pawn on d4 is going to either move to d5 or it's going to trade for one of black's central pawns. That's the hope. And at that point, the bishop on b2 is going to come alive. So let's go d4 and claim the center. And I think that you guys will see that this exact turn of events is going to happen. In addition, you can think of this as functioning as one unit, controlling the e5 square, making it very hard for black to go e5. Okay, so let's think about this bishop. Where should this bishop develop itself? What do you guys think? And there's really only two possibilities. There's this and then there's this. So if we go bishop c4, we walk right into d5 or even b5. So I think the move bishop d3 is more active because, well, it controls a lot of squares, and we prepare the move e4. Now, black is really towing the line here. And one of the things that you have to understand about playing offbeat openings like 1b3 is that if your opponent plays garbage, you need to be able to essentially, in your mind, transition into something more mainstream. So even if you're a b3 player, and I tell this to London players, even though you play the London, if your opponent screws around, then you don't need to always make the London moves. At some point, you just got to say, I'm going to press the gas pedal and I'm going to punish him for this crap. He's not developing any of his pieces. What do we do when our opponent doesn't develop any of his pieces like this? Well, we First of all, we need to control the center, and we open the center. To open the center, we need to first control it with our pawns. So here, it is time for us to play what move? It's time for us to frickin' press that gas pedal down, and that means first playing e4, which is now justified. And, you know, we can consider playing e5 here, but we also can complete our development. I hope this logic makes sense. I would hesitate on e5, because e5 he can meet with knight d5. I would start by castling. Let's play it methodically. So he wants a fishing pole kind of idea. And now I would advocate opening the center. We don't have to play h3. That would be playing into his hands. He wants us to play h3 so that he can leave his knight here and tell us how awesome he is. But by playing knight g4, he's taken his eyes off of a particular square in the center. What square am I talking about? What can we put on that square? How do we press it down? Just bang on his center. Knight f2 is too passive. Boom. d5. Blast things open. Just blast it open, right? Without even calculating, I'm trying to open the e file. This pawn on b5 is going to be weak, and finally, even this guy begins to think. Takes. Now this would be correct. But now b5 is lost. He loses a pawn. This bishop repositions itself onto an active square. And he goes g6. Okay. We need to continue playing actively in order not to let him breathe. It's very important. We need to keep on tightening the noose here. One good way to tighten the noose, I'm looking at this bishop and I'm saying, well, it's undefended. If we look around the board, we look very carefully, what square can we spot with the bishop? We can begin by playing bishop to c6 and attacking the rook. And the bishop is now on an outpost. We don't need to worry about it. And now, as Lono indicates, this pawn on d6 catches my eye. So I'm saying, okay, he's probably going to fianchetto his bishop, which means that the pawn on d6 is going to be left without a defender. And that probably means if we can attack it with a knight, that's going to put him in a bad way. So knight bd2 comes to mind. And now let's reposition the knight to c4, attack the pawn, and also bring this a5 pawn, just keep an eye on it, because something amazing is going to happen if he plays queen c7. Which he probably will. First of all, he goes queen to f6. Okay. So now it's kind of interesting that he's probably going to castle. That part should be clear to everybody. And if he castles, remember that his rook will then be gone from h8. So what will become possible if he castles? Like what particular technique, what thing no longer is a trick that he can apply? The fishing pole line. So we can begin by playing h3 and saying, we're preventing him from castling. He goes king f8. That's not bad. I have to say he's playing in a strange way, but he's not playing badly. Now, let's consider this pawn on d6 for a second. And let's think about ways in which we could increase our dial, in which we could turn the dial up on that pawn. Well, we look carefully, we say, okay, what can attack this pawn? Well, it's on a dark square. Okay, it's on a dark square. Well, what can attack it? The bishop. Well, we need to go to a3, so let's go a4. This pawn is also hanging. We can take it at our leisure. I'm not rushing with that. Yep. Okay. So there's one issue with bishop a3, which is that he might play e4. Okay, goes queen f4. It's a little Monka-esque. I don't want to have to deal with that. So let's just go g3 and send the queen away. Now, you guys might look at this and say, well, doesn't this weaken our king? It does. It certainly does, but it's not a big deal. His position is so passive that we really don't need to worry too much about our king being a little bit weaker. We have enough pieces on the king side to be able to deal with it in more than one way. There's just, you gotta take a little bit of a ballsy decision sometimes. If we took the knight, he would take back and threaten mate on h2. That would be the last thing we'd want to do. We could have also gone bishop c1, which I missed, but that was not necessary. All right. Now comes time for the crusher. Let's not forget what our ultimate idea was. Our entire plan revolves around winning this pawn, and he's walked right into knight takes d6, which now comes with devastating effect. The queen is almost trapped. It has only one square, queen b4, and now our secondary idea comes in. I like how smoothly our plan comes into existence and it crushes. Then we go bishop a3, paving the way for a devastating discovery against his queen. Yep. So we've done everything we wanted to do. Boom, goes the dynamite. His queen is lost. Now where should our knight go? Should we take the bishop? What should we do? This was really nice. Yeah, knight e4 is the simplest. Bye-bye queen and bye-bye everything. Now we can take the knight if we want, but we don't even need to. The simplest is to push this pawn down the middle, d6, right down Main Street. And now we can take the pawn, but let's reposition our knight on the outpost, knight g5. And the game is over. Okay, knight e5. Okay, again, it doesn't matter what you do here. Just take stuff, move stuff. Just don't give away pieces for free. So we can take on e4. We can play bishop d5, bishop b5. We'll just take the pawn, whatever. Just clear the air a little bit. The power of 1b3, h4. Okay, g4 to keep things closed. He's probably going to sack, but sack is quite a bit less scary when he's got no queen. Yeah, his position collapsed. Now, it was not easy. The guy did not play badly. He managed to keep his position from collapsing for a while, but when we put enough pressure on it, he didn't find it in himself to keep the defense going. Knight d5, knight d7. Let's keep attacking f4. His knight is trapped. I'm not really commenting on this stage because anything wins. Yeah, and this game is over, red rover. Yeah. Okay, let's take it. Bishop e5. We can centralize our queen and threaten checkmate. Bishop g6 is another ancillary idea that comes to mind. Let's do it. Destroying the protection around his king. And the game is over. Yeah, too late for thinking, exactly. You should have thought earlier. Okay, I'm literally struggling to figure out which piece to take. This is an all-you-can-eat. This is golden corral right here. This is freaking golden corral. Just push, push, win, take, win, crush. Yep. Another one. Wow. We take another queen. White to play and checkmate in one move. Just to keep you guys on your feet. Good job. When G8 is correct. Yeah. Wow. Okay. There's a lot to unpack here. Now, this is called the Nimzo-Larsen game, opening. Who is it named after? Believe it or not, Nimzo and Larsen. I mean, mind-boggling. It was played for the first time in the year 1837 by a guy named Karl Mayet. And he was a master. I actually know who that is. And Nimzo played it pretty extensively in the, in the 1920s when he was at his most active. But it was played a handful of times in the 1800s, by very adventurous people. Thank you, Inspector Chief. And Morozzi played it. But people with pretty recognizable names. A guy named Magnus played it in 1868. Some guy with a last name Magnus played it in a simul against a strong German master in 1868. Carlsen Magnus. Kolbnowski and Nimzo played it, and with mixed results. And then Larsen played it a ton in the 60s and 70s. And Nimzo was the guy who really advocated for this initially, because people before Nimzo were just experimenting with this. Larsen was the person who really added a lot of theory. Now, B3 has you know, it was on the fringes really until the 2000s when people like Jabava and Report started playing this a lot. And I played this a lot, you know, for a couple of years now, because it turns out that this is a very good way to A, avoid a lot of the theory, and B, get fresh, interesting positions. White's not really aiming for an advantage. White is aiming for interesting positions, and if black is not careful in the main lines, he can definitely get in trouble. So most people respond here with e5. This is the traditional way of responding with black. Some people go d5 here automatically. You remember that you can just take the pawn. I'm sure, Lono, you've had this a million times probably. And after e3, knight f6, there are two main moves. The old main line is bishop e5. This is still good. But recently, I've been playing knight f3. A lot of people have been playing knight f3 in classic hypermodern style, provoking this pawn forward and then trying to attack it and undermine it with moves like d3. So, you know, I like it. It's a good opening. I have a student who plays b3. It's very much sound, and you can study it and become a specialist. Okay, so I should say that the ON, which is e4 b6, is also playable. It's definitely playable at a club player level, but it's much more dubious than b3. e4 b6 you can get crushed if you're not very precise with black, and white is better objectively. b3, white is not worse. This is equal. This is equal if black knows what he's doing, but black can equalize in a million different ways. Okay. So b4, e5, and I just want to tell you guys why e4 is not the best way to play. And when I look at this, it's like if you're a pianist and you're hearing somebody play the wrong notes in a Bach, right? It grates on your ears, it grates on your eyes. Thank you, I am Crom. So it's just the fact that you fianchettoed the bishop and played e4. It's hard to defend this pawn. I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying. Because normally you can play knight c3, but now if you play knight c3, this bishop stares at the knight. That's awkward. And if you play d3, you know, all these holes on the dark squares, and this bishop doesn't have a good square. So it's just not the way that, it's not in the spirit of the line. It's contradictory. You don't play b3 to occupy most of the center. You do it to attack the center with pieces, if that makes sense. All right. So b3, d6 is fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that move, provided that he accompanies it with e5. That's a legitimate way to play. But h5 is obviously completely unhinged. And the funny thing is, the move a5 in this position is a legitimate line. People have played it. Grandmasters, I've faced it myself in an over-the-board rapid game. And the idea is to undermine the pawn chain with a4. But I think that white is probably slightly better here. And the best move against a5 is actually c4. c4 is not an easy move to play if you haven't analyzed this. The point against a4 is not to take it, that ruins your pawn structure, but to go b4. To go b4 and then a3, and then this pawn is going to end up being a big weakness. So just as a little theoretical side note, so bishop b2, h5, e3, a5. We decided to play it more simply with a3. But yes, in over-the-board game, I'd play c4 here, just so you guys know. Okay, so a3. And again, the idea against a4 is to go b4. Now, who can explain to me why the move bishop b5 check doesn't win a pawn? It's b3, it's a good move, but I don't really recommend it to club players. Not bishop d7, although bishop d7 is possible, but the move is c6. Just remember this little trap. Remember this little trap. If you fianchetto your bishop, this bishop doesn't have a passageway back to b3. So that's a good thing to remember. Bishop b5, c6 is fine. Now, you might look at this and say, well, wait a second, what if I take the pawn first? And the point here is black will not do this and blunder his exchange. But the fact is, these pawns are horrible. Black doesn't even have to win the pawn back. It's just that you're saddled with these weaknesses the rest of the game. And it's well worth a pawn that black's probably going to win back anyway. So anyways, knight f6, knight f3. c6, now we occupy the center with d4. Knight b to d7, bishop comes out actively to d3. And the move b5 is what the straw that broke the camel's back. If I was black here, I would go g6 or e6 and just rush to develop my pieces. Now we just say, let's step on knight e4. He correctly played e6 here, because if he had just developed his bishop, who can tell me what white should do here? Black is almost losing already. And this has to do with him playing h5, which weakens the g6 square. That's something which, if you're tactically sharp, you would have noticed immediately. We go e5, and after knight d5, what's the key move? And this is going to be absolutely painful. Just crunching through his position. e6, ugh, this is mate. That's the consequences of playing h5. And if he goes knight f6, well, we can take and boom, boom, boom. Everything comes in with devastating effect. So that's why you don't play moves like h5. Now, he played e6, which is good. It slows down the progress of this pawn. So we decided to take a more conservative approach, castles. After knight g4, when a piece leaves the center like this, it relinquishes control over the central squares. Now, some of you might struggle to figure out why e5 doesn't do the same thing as d5. The reason is simple. Black can go d5 and keep the center closed, but after d5, black can't go e5, right? Because white immediately takes, attacks two pawns. That's why there's often the piece of advice that you should essentially strike in the most well-protected square, which is very paradoxical. But if your goal is to open up the center, the more stuff you hit with your move, the better, if that makes sense. Another thing is, not going h3 here. Remember that when your opponent plays like this, it's obvious what he's aiming for. He wants you to play h3 and take the knight, so we're not playing his game. We're saving a tempo on the move h3 because we won't be able to take the knight anyway. All right, so we strike in the center, d5. Takes e5, thank you for the pawn. There's nothing else that he can do. If he takes, that's obviously much worse. Rook e1, and then we can take the pawn, and then d5 hangs. This is horrible. And please ask any questions as I do this. This is a pretty complicated game, actually. g6. I would have gone bishop e7 instead, but okay. Yeah, why couldn't you take the knight? Good question. Sorry, I should have explained this. So this is called the fishing pole trap. White is not losing here, but white's going to have to give the knight back. Because if you move your knight just myopically, then queen h4 comes. Mate is threatened on the h2 and h1 squares. All that remains is to try to open up a escape passageway. But black shuts this down with g3, and now queen h1 is unstoppable. So if you find yourself in this situation, you're like, oh shit, I forgot that this fails. Don't panic. Usually the way to deal with this is to play the move g3. That's a weird looking move. Why? Because you want to move the knight to h4 and use it as a stopgap. If black takes, then you bring your queen out. If black tries to get the queen, to h6, for example, well, your queen is already close enough to stop the worst of it. You can go bishop c1, so you have the resources and the firepower now to prevent the immediate checkmate. All right, so just as a note, if you find yourself in this situation, don't be afraid to give your knight back. All right, so d5 takes e5, we take the pawn. g6, bishop c6, right? Bringing the bishop onto an outpost, making sure that it's defended, hitting the rook. Now knight b to d2. This is the typical development move in any b3 system. But in particular, we're already eyeing this pawn on d6, knowing that he wants to fianchetto, thinking ahead, knight c4. This is why anticipation is so important in chess, right? You have to anticipate where your opponent is going to develop. You have to, it's like when you're driving, you're making a left turn against traffic. You start driving before the last car passes you, right? So you can make it in the space you have available. And here it's the same thing. You don't need to wait for your opponent to do stuff before you begin your plans. You know he's going to develop his bishop to g7, so let's begin already turning so that we can get knight c4 in time. Okay. What was the cool move after queen c7? Did I say there was a cool move here? Did I say there was a cool move here? Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, okay. So the move here was to, sorry. The move here was to target the a5 pawn with bishop c3. It's not as cool as maybe I made it out to be. I just thought it was interesting that, to be honest, I thought the queen was trapped here. I forgot the queen as this square. But then we can drop the bishop back and hit this pawn. I just thought it was a nice way to combine the attack on all of black's weaknesses. And that is the reason why we want the knight to be on c4. There's two reasons behind knight e4 being worse than knight c4. The first is the knight is undefended here. I like putting my pieces on squares where they're defended by pawns. You know that. But the main reason is that this knight also brings under attack the a5 square, a5 pawn, which could be important later on. Okay, so knight c4, queen f6. Now we go h3. Now we go h3. And it's the same principle. We are preparing for the eventuality that he will castle, in which case he will lose the knight. Yeah, and then we can just move the knight. Ryan, at this point, can we take the knight, and if he takes to the queen, we can skewer? Wait, in which position? Oh, okay. Now, if he would have moved the knight away to h6, we would have had a very pretty tactic that wins the game immediately. Who can spot this tactic? This is not an easy tactic, but you should sense intuitively. Look at how all of our pieces are aimed in one way or another, either at his king or at the center. Something's got to give here, and so you should start looking for these sacrifices. This is totally crushing. Look at how everything is hanging. This bishop pins the knight. If he moves the queen, we take on g7, and everything collapses. And this is why chess is logical at this kind of a level, because you do everything right, you're going to have a tactic like this. So if he goes king f8, that's a nice move. And now we switch our attention to increasing the attack on the d6 pawn by repositioning our bishop. Okay, queen f4. We're not intimidated. We just simply go g3, get out of there. Queen e4 is the decisive mistake. You should have gone back to f6. But at this point, we already can take the knight. At least we can consider it. And this is an advanced idea. We can go knight h2. The point is our pawn on g3 prevents the queen from coming to h4. And we have just enough time, perhaps, to get our rook then to h1. But this is not necessary. If you don't feel comfortable, you can simply go bishop a3 and win this pawn. You could even consider bishop c1, bishop g5, which traps the queen. But that's a little bit too much of a kind of a trappy move. Yeah, so why did I go g3? Now, I didn't have to, strictly speaking. But I don't like situations where a single minor piece is what stands between me and checkmate. And what worries me about these scenarios is a move, hypothetically, doesn't work here, but a move such as e4 could come, and all of a sudden you're in a situation where you have to do all this damage control because your knight can't move and it's attacked, if that makes sense. So we can afford this kind of luxury because our position is so dominant here. Queen e4, now we take. Now bishop a3 completes the cycle. Queen has nowhere to go. He goes to b6. We can take the bishop and win it. He goes to c3 as he did. We go back to e4. Or knight b5 would have been winning as well. Crushing on the spot. Any questions? Now a4 asks, why can't you take the knight instead of playing g3? Because here, this would be one of the worst versions of the fishing pole trap, because we can't move the knight due to checkmate. But if you were in this situation, who can spot an inventive defense? White does have a defense here, which I think leads to a winning position for white, but this is an only move. I mentioned this move during the game. It's not g3. Now, g3 is okay, but g3 leads to queen takes f3. This leads to a winning endgame for white. What other move do you guys see? Same kind of idea, bishop to c1. Not easy to see, but it's better than g3 because the knight is untouchable. Queen has to move away. And no matter where the queen moves, you can use the knight to block the queen's passageway to the h file. Same thing after queen f5. Don't go here because that merely encourages the queen to come to h5. But instead you go knight to g5, stopping the queen, putting the knight's body over the queen's passage to h5. So it's all logical. You just got to be aware of all these ideas. Okay? But these fishing pole traps can be hard to deal with, which is why, unless you have to take the knight, there's no need to. Okay, so in the game, yeah, we went g3, bishop a3, and once we won the queen, everything was very straightforward. Very, very straightforward. So a very rich game. Lots of stuff went on, and it was the first time that we played 1b3. And this is certainly a move which you can try out. It's not horribly theoretical. There's some stuff to learn. Thank you, Lono the 5. Thank you so much, Dr. Lono. And I'm sorry for keeping you waiting for so long. I've been promising a B3 game forever. I don't know why I didn't play it. I play it often myself in real games as Theodore Mushroom priming as well. So, any conceptual questions? Why not castle before you open center? Well, we did. We did castle before we opened center. That's it. We did. We castled first, and then we opened center afterward. Right? So we followed the rules here. I did play a B3 game apparently. Okay. Now, another thing I wanted to make a more conceptual takeaway from this game. I see this problem a lot in London players. I mentioned this during the game, where let's say that you're playing the London and some guy plays A5 against you. A lot of London players will sort of close their eyes and they'll go E3. And then they'll go H3 and they'll make the same moves against every single system, which is exactly why I hesitate to recommend this to people who are just learning. Now, what should you do here? Well, you should recognize that your opponent is violating the rules. So you need to deviate from the main setup and immediately claim the center. This is a good chance for you to get a dominant position in the opening. And you shouldn't be afraid, even as a London player, to play C4 and E4 and D4. You know, a lot of people over-identify with, I am a London player, I only play this system, and they put their head down and do this against literally everything. You need to be able to have that instinct to deviate your setup when your opponent is doing something crappy. Well, the London is a good opening. The London is a good opening. Well, you can't play E4. I would love to play E4, but the knight defends that square. The Benoni is good at a high level, yeah. No, I just made a random, crappy move to show an example of that. The English is a great opening. Well, the main plan is just to get the pieces out. I mean, I don't know, let's say you go E4. Well, it depends. I mean, black has already lost because you want to go E5 and push this knight back. But yeah, you just get your pieces out, castle, and then continue the central expansion. Is there a general technique to learn the ideas of openings? At my level, theory basically doesn't exist. Well, first of all, there's no level at which theory doesn't exist, unless you're you've just learned the rules, like you're 400, 500. YouTube videos are great. Nowadays, there's YouTube videos on a lot of different stuff. Thank you, Spacetime Cowboy. I see people trying to bribe me. There's YouTube videos on a lot of different stuff. And, Levy's got a lot of good videos. There's just a lot of good stuff. Eventually, I'll have more opening videos explaining ideas. But remember that even as a beginner, you can learn a little bit of theory. You shouldn't be allergic to memorization. And that's a pretty unconventional thing to say, but, I'm full of unconventional views.